Okay, so A2 E-block questions. How do women make ends meet? What do they do with leftover money? That's really interesting because one of the key features of a lot of developing countries, and a key feature of Britain maybe until 50 years ago, is that men generally have control of the household financial resources. So women will be given a small amount of money to maintain the household, but the rest of the money stays with men, which means that there is no money left over, and women have very little financial independence from men. And it's interesting now, if you see in Britain, they're talking about removing child benefit. Child benefit was set up as a way of giving women a small amount of financial independence in an environment where men controlled all of the financial resources. And in developing countries, we don't have this level of financial independence for poor women. And it's a major problem because, of course, women are far more concerned about spending money on healthcare and nutrition and planning for the future and saving, whereas men tend to be rather more irresponsible with their money and don't put money aside. Consequently, we have projects to try and set up saving schemes so that women have a degree of financial independence. The women will club together and set up a small bank between them, and then everyone will put money in, a very small amount of money each month, and that money is distributed when there's an emergency or some sort of health crisis, and that's been shown to have quite a big impact on poverty. Are people welcoming when you enter the communities? Well, this is a really important point because in Nepal was basically in the middle of a civil war for the last 10 years, and we weren't able to enter a lot of the communities. And that was one of the really strong points about this key informant monitoring research method, that we could have local people go in and ask the questions and then come and feed the data back to us, which meant we and our research staff didn't have to go into communities where there was a risk of kidnap and violence, because the Maoist movement was an armed movement, and so access to a lot of Nepal was extremely difficult for many years, really up until about 2 years ago. The whole point of this method is really that we often don't have to go into the communities, and often, other than personal interest, there's no need for the researcher to go into the community if you can get better quality data by leaving the environment in a more natural state, if you like. If you see a lot of, particularly Western researchers coming into a village with clipboards and asking questions, inevitably it biases the data. People are wondering, what are we going to get out of this? Are they going to come and build us a new hospital, etc., etc.? So in some ways it's better to leave the field uncontaminated, if you like. And that's quite an interesting research methods issue to discuss, I think. How do researchers impact the world that they're researching, particularly in qualitative methods? The worst situation you've seen, well, that's tricky. The data that we have from Nepal is really harrowing, and I can share some of it with you, but the stories are terrible. When you hear of women dying in childbirth, or surviving with terrible injuries, obviously it's absolutely awful. We came across a case in Nepal recently, in a village where a woman who was pregnant had a leg prolapse, so the leg of the baby was sticking out of the woman and she needed emergency medical attention, and we were able to take her to hospital, but if we hadn't, it's very possible the woman and the baby would have died. Now, that's obviously a harrowing situation, but I didn't know the woman, and I didn't have any personal relationships with them. And I think for me, living in developing countries, it's only when you really have a relationship with people that it affects you very deeply, because you obviously, in a country like India, you see poverty around you every day, and there are hundreds of millions of tragic stories. So I think the thing that's affected me most is a good friend of mine being imprisoned in Eritrea for avoiding national service, and when it's someone who you have a relationship with, obviously it really impacts you much more. The most rewarding aspect of your job, well, that's quite difficult, because the impacts of a job like mine are felt over 10 or 15 years, and you see them in the data. So if you look at Nepal, maternal mortality has nearly halved over the last 10 years, and that's the result of a huge number of people working in lots of different ways to strengthen the hospitals, to buy ambulances, to strengthen the government's capacity to plan the health service, to lobby for more money for the health service, then to try and look at how to make these benefits felt in rural areas and to support that with research. And of course my work is as a member of a team that has been working on just one very small aspect of this. So it's intellectually rewarding, but you don't really get the rewards of feeling like you've really changed anything, because the processes are so slow. But that's not to say it's not rewarding, because if you feel you've had a role to play in improving the situation, obviously that is rewarding in itself. The next question, how aware are the women of how badly they're treated compared with other societies? Well, again, I think to answer that question you'd have to do research across different societies and compare. I would say that it's surprising how aware Nepali women are, given the centuries and generations of oppression. I would have half expected women just to be very fatalistic and say, well, this is how life for a woman is, and we didn't see that. I remember one of the quotes that I put in the front page of my PhD was, our lives, we spend our lives crying and playing with these mud and stones. Women are aware of the very, very desperate state of their lives and the extreme poverty and marginalisation. And I think if there's any impact, someone asked about the impact of modern technology, I think there is an impact in that people see that not everyone lives in these extreme conditions, and that can be a positive force for change, I think. How can Western aid be better spent on medical supplies, or should it be given to the teaching of basic medical knowledge? Well, the giving of aid is a really interesting question. The giving of aid is incredibly complex, and from Britain, the image people get is very, very skewed, because by far the vast majority of aid money goes from the British government and from the World Bank and from other big country donors, what we call bilateral donors, to the government of, for example, Nepal. Whereas in Britain you tend to see more like a higher profile being given to charities and NGOs, because of course they have an interest in increasing their profile and their public image. Where should the money be spent? Well, at the moment, the way in which most of the money is spent in Nepal is relatively good, in that it goes to the government to help them to strengthen services, and then we also provide technical assistance, consultants, know-how to strengthen the systems and make that money work more effectively for the good of people. I think money that goes in via NGOs is to some extent valuable, but it's very, very small compared to the scale of the problem. So how can money be better spent? Well, that's very difficult, because of course if you take the example of Nepal, the capacity of government is very weak. The skills are not there. And so however much money you pump into that system, if they don't have expert economists, expert planners, then you're never going to get very, very good results. And unfortunately, it's just a reality of international development that you don't get the efficiency out of the money that you would if you were to put it into the NHS, for example, which runs very efficiently. It's inevitable that in weak systems, the results that you get are less effective. So where that money should go, I think we've probably got it about right. It's very challenging, but at the moment the money goes straight to government, most of it, and then we provide assistance in spending it effectively, and I think that's the way it should be. It also means the Nepali government have a say over how that money is spent, which I think in a democracy that's also important. How do Nepali women view women from the Western world? I've no idea. We didn't ask. How do people in that society want to change? Do they want to change to a more Western way of life? Again, I've no idea. I would say that certainly if you look at the mass media in India and Nepal, there is an aspiration towards wealth and towards a better material standard of living. But But it's quite difficult because most of the Indian media, a bit like the Western media, is controlled by men. And so if you were to try and